The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty town of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory in the summer of 1882. The heat shimmered off the wooden buildings like ghostly dancers, and even the lizards sought shade beneath the weathered boardwalks. It was the kind of day when sensible folks stayed indoors with their shutters drawn, sipping cool water and waiting for evening to bring relief. But Jake Quickdraw McGraw wasn't sensible folk. He sat astride his paint horse, Ranger, at the crest of Widow's Hill, surveying the town below with the calculating eyes of a man who'd spent 15 years hunting the worst killers and thieves the frontier had to offer. At 34, Jake had already become a legend. The fastest gun west of the Mississippi, they said, a man who could draw and fire before his opponent's hand even touched leather. The badge, pinned to his leather vest, caught the sunlight, a silver star that marked him as a deputy U.S. Marshal. But it was the twin Colt .45 peacemakers hanging low on his hips that truly defined him. Those guns had spoken justice in a dozen territories, their voices echoing through countless saloons, dusty streets, and hidden canyons where desperate men made their last stands. Today, those guns would speak again. Jake pulled a crumpled wanted poster from his shirt pocket and studied the crude drawing for the 100th time. Black Pete Morrison, wanted for murder, robbery, and cattle rustling across 3 territories. The reward was $500, dead or alive, but Jake had never brought in a man dead if he could help it. He believed in justice, not vengeance, though he'd learned the hard way that some men wouldn't give you a choice. Black Pete had been terrorizing the Silver Creek area for months, hitting stagecoaches, rustling cattle, and killing anyone who got in his way. Just last week, he'd gunned down a young deputy in Tombstone, a kid barely old enough to shave who'd tried to arrest him for disturbing the peace. That killing had been the last straw for Jake. Some crimes demanded personal attention. The trail had led him here, to Silver Creek, following reports from frightened travelers and angry ranchers. Pete's gang had been seen watering their horses at Miller's Creek just north of town, and Jake's instincts told him the outlaw was close. Very close. Jake touched his heels to Ranger's flanks and rode down the hill toward town, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Silver Creek was a typical frontier settlement, a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a few side streets with modest homes, and the inevitable collection of saloons, general stores, and boarding houses that served the miners, ranchers, and drifters who passed through. The Silver Dollar Saloon dominated the center of town, its bat-wing doors standing open to catch any breeze that might stir the stifling air. Even from a distance, Jake could hear the tinkling of an out-of-tune piano and the rough laughter of men seeking liquid relief from the heat and the hardships of frontier life. As Jake rode slowly down Main Street, he noticed how the townspeople reacted to his presence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, children were quickly ushered indoors, and more than one shopkeeper found urgent business in the back of his store. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Jake's reputation had preceded him. He dismounted in front of the Silver Dollar and tied Ranger to the hitching post, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The horse nickered softly and nuzzled Jake's shoulder, a gesture of affection that reminded him of gentler times, before his life had become an endless succession of wanted posters and gunfights. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, stroking the paint's neck. "This shouldn't take long." The saloon fell silent as Jake pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs jingling softly on the sawdust-covered floor. The interior was dim after the blazing sunlight outside, filled with the familiar smells of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. A dozen men occupied the various tables and bar stools, their faces turning toward the newcomer, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. Jake's eyes adjusted quickly to the gloom, a skill honed by years of entering dark places where death might be waiting in any shadow. He scanned the room methodically, cataloging faces, noting the position of hands, watching for the telltale signs of men preparing for violence. The bartender, a heavy-set man with graying hair and nervous eyes, continued polishing a glass with hands that shook slightly. "Afternoon, Marshal," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for Black Pete Morrison," Jake announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I have reason to believe he's in the area." The bartender's hands shook a little more. "He ain't here, McGraw. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him." Jake's eyes never stopped moving, reading the faces around him like a gambler reading cards. Most of the men looked genuinely surprised by his announcement, but a few showed the kind of nervous tension that came from guilty knowledge. "His horse is outside," Jake said quietly. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. Jake had spotted a big black stallion tied behind the saloon, the kind of horse a man like Black Pete would ride. The reaction to his words confirmed his suspicion. A chair scraped loudly in the back corner of the saloon, and every head turned toward the sound. A man rose slowly from a table where he'd been playing solitaire, his movements deliberate and threatening. He was tall and lean, with the kind of pale skin that spoke of too much time spent in saloons and not enough in honest sunlight. His clothes were expensive but travel-stained, and the gun at his hip was worn low in the manner of a professional killer. But it was his face that marked him as Black Pete Morrison. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, the souvenir of a knife fight in El Paso 3 years earlier. His eyes were the color of winter ice, cold and empty of anything resembling human warmth. Well, Black Pete said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "If it isn't the famous quick-draw McGraw, I was wondering when you'd show up." Jake turned to face the outlaw fully, his hands hanging loose at his sides but ready to move with lightning speed if necessary. "Pete Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Deputy Billy Carson in Tombstone, along with a list of other charges long enough to paper this wall." Pete laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You always were one for the dramatic speeches, McGraw, but I'm afraid I'm not in the mood to be arrested today." "Then I'm giving you a choice," Jake replied, his voice steady and calm. "Surrender peaceful-like and you'll get a fair trial, or we can settle this the hard way." The other patrons of the saloon began edging toward the doors and windows, recognizing the signs of an impending gunfight. The bartender ducked behind his bar, and the piano player abandoned his instrument with such haste that the bench toppled over with a crash. Pete's hand hovered near his gun, his fingers flexing slightly as he prepared for the draw. "You know what I choose, McGraw. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. They say you're the fastest gun in the West, but I've got news for you. That reputation's about to change hands." "I've heard that before," Jake said quietly. 43 times to be exact. The number hung in the air between them like a death sentence. 43 men had faced Quick-Draw McGraw in fair fights, and 43 men had lost. Some had died, others had lived to face trial, but all had learned that Jake's reputation was well-deserved. The saloon emptied with remarkable speed, patrons scrambling for the exits like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Within moments, only Jake and Black Pete remained, facing each other across 20 feet of sawdust-covered floor. The silence was so complete that Jake could hear the ticking of the clock behind the bar and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in town. "Just you and me now, McGraw," Pete said, his voice tight with anticipation. "No witnesses, no law, just 2 men and their guns, the way it should be." "There's always a choice, Pete," Jake replied. "Even now. Drop your gun belt and walk out of here alive." Pete's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think I'm afraid of you? I've killed 12 men in fair fights, McGraw. 12, and I'm faster than I was when I killed the first one." "Speed isn't everything," Jake said. "Sometimes it's about being right." "Pretty words," Pete sneered. "Let's see how fast your philosophy draws." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Both men stood perfectly still, their eyes locked, their hands poised near their weapons. Outside, Jake could hear the sound of running feet as word of the impending gunfight spread through the town. Soon, every window and doorway would be filled with spectators, drawn by the morbid fascination that such confrontations always inspired. "On 3?" Pete asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. "Your count." Pete's eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. He'd been planning this moment for months, ever since he'd first heard that Quick-Draw McGraw was on his trail. In his mind, he'd already won, already seen himself standing over the famous marshal's body, claiming the reputation that would make him the most feared gunman in the West. 1. Jake's breathing slowed, his mind entering the strange, calm state that had kept him alive through dozens of such confrontations. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second lasting an eternity. He could see every detail of Pete's face, every twitch of muscle, every flicker of expression. 2. A bead of sweat rolled down Pete's forehead despite the relative coolness of the saloon's interior. His hand trembled slightly, betraying the nervousness he was trying so hard to hide. Jake noticed the tremor and filed it away. A man who was truly confident didn't shake before a gunfight. Pete went for his gun early, his nerve breaking under the pressure of Jake's steady gaze. His hand flashed downward, fingers closing around the grip of his Colt. But Jake was ready for the treachery. He'd seen it before, desperate men who tried to gain an advantage by breaking the rules of the duel. Jake's draw was a thing of beauty, a fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics. One moment his hands were empty, the next his right hand Colt was in his grip, the barrel already swinging toward his target. The gun bucked in his hand, flame and smoke erupting from the muzzle, the report echoing through the saloon like thunder. Pete's gun had barely cleared leather when Jake's bullet took him in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. The outlaw stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arm, his face twisted with pain and disbelief. "Should have waited for 3, Jake said, already holstering his weapon with the same fluid grace he'd used to draw it. "Now, you're coming with me to face justice for those stagecoach robberies and that deputy you killed in Tombstone." Pete slumped against the wall, his face pale with shock and blood loss. You could have killed me," he gasped. "Could have," Jake agreed, pulling a clean bandana from his pocket and moving to tend the outlaw's wound. "But I'm not an executioner, Pete. I'm a lawman. There's a difference." As Jake bound Pete's shoulder with practiced efficiency, the saloon began to fill again with curious townspeople who had watched the brief gunfight from the safety of doorways and windows. They stared at the famous marshal with a mixture of awe and relief, knowing that their town was now safe from Black Pete Morrison's depredations. The local sheriff, a portly man named Tom Bradley, pushed through the crowd with his deputy in tow. "Marshal McGraw," he said, slightly out of breath from his hurried arrival. "I heard gunshots. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Sheriff," Jake replied, helping the wounded outlaw to his feet. "Black Pete Morrison is now your prisoner, at least until the federal marshals can arrange transport to Tucson for trial." Sheriff Bradley stared at the notorious outlaw with undisguised amazement. "Black Pete Morrison? Here in Silver Creek?" "Marshal, we can't thank you enough. This man's been terrorizing the whole territory." "Just doing my job," Jake said modestly, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at another successful capture. "You'll want to get him to the doctor for that shoulder, then lock him up tight. He's got friends who might try to break him out." As the sheriff and his deputy led Black Pete away, the crowd in the saloon began to disperse, though many lingered to get a closer look at the legendary quick-draw McGraw. Jake accepted their thanks with quiet dignity, but he was already thinking about his next assignment, the next wanted poster in his saddlebags. The bartender, emboldened by the successful conclusion of the confrontation, emerged from behind his bar with a bottle of his finest whiskey. "Marshal McGraw," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "this one's on the house. It's the least we can do for the man who rid us of Black Pete Morrison." Jake accepted the drink gratefully, downing it in a single swallow. The whiskey burned pleasantly as it went down, washing away the taste of gun smoke and tension. "Much obliged," he said, setting the empty glass on the bar. As Jake prepared to leave, an elderly man approached him with tears in his eyes. "Marshal," the man said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I want to thank you personal-like. Black Pete and his gang hit my ranch last month, killed my foreman and stole half my cattle. I thought I was ruined, but now there's a chance for justice." Jake placed a gentle hand on the old rancher's shoulder. "Justice will be served, sir. Black Pete will face trial for all his crimes, including what he did to your ranch." Similar scenes played out as Jake made his way toward the door. A widow whose husband had been killed in one of Pete's stagecoach robberies, a merchant who'd been terrorized by the outlaw gang, a young mother whose children could now play safely in the streets. All of them wanted to express their gratitude to the man who had made their community safe again. Outside the saloon, Jake found a crowd gathered around Ranger, admiring the paint horse that had carried the famous marshal on so many adventures. Children who had been hiding indoors now pressed close, their eyes wide with hero worship as they stared at the living legend. "Is it true you faced down 43 gunfighters?" asked a boy of perhaps 10 years, his voice filled with awe. Jake smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "It's true, son, but I hope you never have to face down even one. There are better ways to solve problems than with guns." "But you're a hero," the boy protested. "You save people and catch bad men." "Being a hero isn't about how fast you can draw a gun," Jake replied gently. "It's about standing up for what's right, protecting those who can't protect themselves, and never giving up when things get tough. You remember that?" As Jake mounted Ranger and prepared to ride out of town, the crowd gathered to see him off. Men removed their hats, women waved handkerchiefs, and children cheered as the legendary marshal touched his hat brim in farewell. "Where will you go now, Marshal?" called out Sheriff Bradley. Jake pulled another wanted poster from his pocket and studied it briefly. "Got word that the Dalton brothers are holed up near Prescott," he said. "Seems like they need a visit from the law." The crowd murmured with excitement at the mention of the notorious Dalton gang, another group of outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory. If Quick Draw McGraw was going after them, their reign of terror would soon be over. As Jake rode slowly down Main Street, the townspeople lined the boardwalks to watch him go. He cut an impressive figure in the saddle, tall and straight-backed, his silver badge gleaming in the afternoon sun, his twin colts riding easy on his hips. This was how legends were made, in moments like these, when a single man stood between civilization and chaos. At the edge of town, Jake paused to look back at Silver Creek one last time. Smoke was rising from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. Children were playing in the streets without fear, and merchants were reopening their shops with confidence. It was a good feeling, knowing that his work had made a difference in the lives of these people. But there was no time to rest on his laurels. Somewhere out there, the Dalton brothers were planning their next robbery, their next act of violence against innocent people. And somewhere beyond that, other outlaws were terrorizing other communities, leaving trails of fear and suffering in their wake. Jake touched his heels to Ranger's flanks and rode toward the setting sun, his silhouette growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the shimmering heat haze of the desert. Behind him, the people of Silver Creek went about their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and their protector was already on his way to help others in need. The legend of Quick Draw McGraw would grow with each telling of the story, embellished and expanded until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. A good man with fast guns and an unshakable moral compass, riding from town to town, bringing law and order to a wild and dangerous frontier. As the sun set over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jake McGraw rode on toward his next adventure, his next chance to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. It was a lonely life, but it was the life he had chosen, and he wouldn't trade it for all the gold in California. The frontier needed men like Quick Draw McGraw, men who were willing to face down the darkness so that others could live in the light. And as long as there were outlaws to catch and wrongs to right, Jake would be there, his guns ready and his courage unwavering. Another job done, another town saved, another chapter in the legend of the fastest gun in the West.